This is episode 5 of Off-Road Independence. This podcast is brought to you by BeginnersFab.com, the site that teaches you how to make useful, interesting, and creative things with basic tools. Think you don't have the fabrication tools necessary to make what you need? Think again. BeginnersFab.com. This is Off-Road Independence, the podcast that talks about trail repair, vehicle modification, and gear selection, helping you become more independent in your off-road adventures. Hi, and welcome to Off-Road Independence. I'm Eric McGrew, your host. And today on our podcast, we're with Brad Blake. I've met Brad through Planet Isuzu, which is an Isuzu forum, and the forum has really helped me grow in the knowledge of my Isuzus and off-road experience as well. Brad has actually had a number of off-road vehicles, and currently he has at least one that I know of, which is his Isuzu Amigo, which he's done a SAS on. He has a few other things on it. So we're gonna talk to Brad not only about his Isuzu, but also about other aspects of off-roading. So, hey Brad, I'm really glad that you were able to get on with me today through Skype so that we could talk about this information on the podcast. Thanks for being with us.
No problem.
So, as I was mentioning, you have a 2000 Isuzu Amigo, right? What have you done to it?
First of all, it was a wreck. Frame was all destroyed, so I put it back on the road and then started rebuilding the old frame, cut the front off, and I knew that I wanted to go solid axle. So at that point, it was just clean off all the brackets and everything, and I wanted to step that one up. My previous one was leaf spring, so I had already been playing with 4-link suspension, so I went ahead and built a front 4-link suspension using rear parts, so pretty much kind of factory stuff, just, reusing it.
You've got a turbo setup, right?
Yes.
And what turbo are you using on that truck?
It's off of a Dodge pickup.
Okay, and what made you go turbo with it?
I had a turbo buggy, little Volkswagen that I had a lot of fun with, and I guess a buddy of mine has a supercharged one, and I know there's a fellow named Jerry Lamont, well known in the Isuzu community, has a supercharged Trooper. And, I like to experiment and do stupid things, so why not build a manifold and set this thing up? I happen to have an extra motor that I put on an engine stand, so I use that for my jig. And the only thing I couldn't do, I just had to guesstimate like the crossover pipe to where it wouldn't hit on the transmission when all this got bolted in.
Yeah.
So I think I spent almost a year setting that up. I just kind of took my time and lollygagged and finally got it all ready and just bit the bullet and put it in one day.
It's incredible what your Amigo is capable of doing on the road. I've seen your YouTube videos and stuff like that. You're still working on a few things with that turbo setup, right? You're trying to tweak out some of the fuel in the different ranges.
the mass airflow sensor. Later, I found out it was the wrong FIC. It couldn't deal with the frequency, so I had to X-day that part and just, try to tune around that. The best thing I could do, at least, was retard the timing.
Like I said, I mean, it's pretty impressive what you've done with it to begin with. And talking about this, for those who are new to turboing a car or whatever, they can kind of understand what some of the processes that you've had to go through just on the tuning side, the electronic side, because a lot of people think of turbos as being very mechanical, and they are. But today, in this world, with the motors the way that they are, there's a lot of electronic side that goes to it with the computers and trying to get them to work that way as well, especially in the newer vehicles.
Yeah. The worst thing is Isuzu, I don't even know if anybody else has done it. I know I've heard of at least 2 or 3 other people, I think maybe 2, that have turbocharged Isuzus. I know there's been a lot of people that have supercharged them, and they actually sell a setup for airplanes, a supercharged 3.5. And that's a cool looking setup. As far as what the ECU does, I've had to learn that. I've done many drives where my laptop's on the seat, sitting there watching everything. But what it finally boiled down to, well, I put in the intercooler, and that cooled the charge air going into the motor. That made a big difference.
Yeah.
But then what was happening with the blow through is, like, in third gear, I would get up to about 4,500, and it would have a turbulence issue, and it would trip the mass airflow system, and I would get a complete system shutdown. So I'm on the freeway when the first time that this happened. I shift it down, I stomp on it, takes off, probably hits 70 or 80. It was running great, and all of a sudden the lights all blow on the dash, and there's nothing. No power, no nothing. All I can do is shut the key off and try turning it back on. Still nothing.
Sounds like fun.
Oh, yeah, I'm in the middle lane too, big 4-lane freeway. And so turn the key off again, and I try to wait another 5-6 seconds, getting pretty nervous by this time. Turn the key back on, and boom, it's working.
Yeah.
So anyway, once I was running 2.5-inch pipe, and the biggest concern with that is room. Once you go put in the intercooler, so you have to have piping going from the turbo out to the intercooler, from the intercooler back into the engine.
Yeah. In fact, to fit some of that for the intercooler, you had to cut through some of the core support up front, right?
Just a little bit of trimming. And this last time I did some more reading and stuff, and I read where you need to have the piping match your mass airflow sensor. And what I did is I originally had bushed up the piping. So 2.5 bushed up to 3-inch going through the mass airflow sensor, and then both sides. And then I went through an elbow right to the throttle. And so anyway, once I went up to 3-inch from, coming off of the intercooler, I was able to bump it up like halfway through. I also read that if you have 90-degree bends before or after, it's going to cause issues. That has ceased to give me any trouble because, tight tolerances, I couldn't help but be close to 90-degree bends. So anyway, that was the magic thing. Going up to 3-inch, I can now pull 5+ 1,000 RPM in third gear, and it's just wild.
Yeah. So let's clarify a little bit for maybe some of the the guys that are beginners to off-road or something like that, right? Why would somebody possibly be thinking about putting a turbo on a vehicle? What benefits would they really get out of putting a turbo on an off-road vehicle, for instance? Because a lot of times turbos are thought to be with drag cars or drift cars or whatever that are street performance.
Well, if you think about the diesel side, obviously they make some crazy horsepower and can go fast. But getting up in altitude, you have bigger tires. I'm running 410 gear ratios, which they're really good. But you get up in altitude and it starts to get sluggish. Keep it in low drive and you have to run the lower gears. So then you're going slower. And, if you're running with people, then, you got to keep up or you got to do this and that. So the turbo, that's where it's golden. I can be in high drive now, first gear or second gear, chugging up some of these steep poles up at 7,000 feet, whatever, pretty good altitude. And it just marches right along.
Yeah, so that everybody's a little clear, because I know that the majority of the listeners to this podcast aren't going to have Isuzus. And some of them may not even remember what the models are like, but an Isuzu Amigo would be just slightly smaller than like a 4Runner from the mid-90s, right?
Yeah, well, it's a two-door version of its brother, the Rodeo.
On yours in particular, you have the exoskeleton cage on there, right? You have an exo cage on yours.
Yes, and that's another point. My machine went from factory weight of, I think, around 3,700 pounds. I'm pushing 5,000 pounds now with everything that's on there. Yeah. And even, the turbo, it obviously adds horsepower, but they're great for torque. So that torque up in the woods, pulling hills, that extra push torque when you're out on the freeway in fourth and fifth gear, fighting a headwind, you only need 3 or 4 pounds of boost. Obviously, I can pull more, but when I'm low RPMs, it'll just sit there and chug down the road, 4 pounds of boost, and it's way better than it used to be.
What size tires are you running right now on your rig?
33s.
You're running 33, so that's a pretty standard tire that a lot of off-road guys are running and that kind of stuff. So you can kind of see why, and I'm talking more, to the audience now. Yeah. You can see why that would be really beneficial to consider possibly a turbo setup, because, these days turbos have really gotten fairly economical. There's so many cars that have them that you can get them off of blown motors or, stuff online. Intercoolers are fairly cheap. And if I'm not mistaken, there's a couple of guys company-wise that are making them for like the really popular vehicles, the Land Cruisers, the 4Runners, the Tacomas, the Jeep JKs, all the Wrangler models, all the Cherokee models. In fact, I think they have quite a few kits for that stuff. And those are all vehicles that a lot of people are running out there. So they could be benefited by having this kind of setup, right?
Oh, yeah. They probably have more of an aftermarket supply for parts, too, to be able to do it. But, yeah, like example, I eBayed my intercooler, and I think it was $45, maybe $60 at the most. But it was a great deal.
Yeah. Maybe one of the things that a lot of people have in question is, what should I have with me at all times when I'm off-roading? What would you suggest? Like, what are some basic things that somebody should have with them almost at all times when they're off-roading?
A phone is nice. And if you're planning on going way out, have a map.
Yeah.
Well, everybody wants to do the GPS map thing. And there's been several times I'm up in the woods with my buddies. They're so busy staring at their coordinates on their phones and stuff. And then they get turned around and lost. And then my other buddy will pull over and pull out all of his paper maps. We're right here.
Yeah.
Something like that. But, depending if you're just wanting to go up and poop around for the day, make sure you have a spare tire. Make sure you have a jack. The basic essentials. Mm-hmm. And, people pack food and stuff. And depending on the time of year, warm clothing, dry, raincoat, stuff like that. If you got broke down, if you got stranded.
Now, are you a 1-jack guy or a 2-jack guy? Because I know a lot of guys that say, I have my high lift, for instance, and that's all I use. And then, like me personally, I prefer to use a high lift to get the weight of the chassis off. And then I use a bottle jack a lot of times to lift the axle up, because that eliminates me having to lift the chassis as high on the high lift, because, high lifts tend to get a little wonky.
You're unloading everything.
Yeah. So what do you use? Do you use just 1-jack, 2 jacks?
I've been lucky. I haven't, I guess years ago I was climbing out of a canyon with my Blazer, and I had already had a tire get full of mud in the wheel, and it popped the bead. So then I put the spare on, and I'm climbing up out of this trail in a canyon, really steep, and suddenly it was tight quarters. Same thing happened. Another tire got mud packed into the bead, and boom, flat tire. And so I just that little bit of less traction, I couldn't go any farther. And a buddy of mine was way up on top, and luckily he had a winch. So we ran the winch down, secured the truck, and I believe they had a high lift, I think is what we did. And then we just jacked that one side up. But preferably, in a given situation, especially like with my Amigo, it has more flex. You're going to be putting that high lift way up in the air. And when, the higher you get those things, they get real tippy.
Yeah.
And that's a very good point to lift it if you need to at the high lift, and then put a jack under the axle.
Yeah, I bought a 5-foot jack because of the travel on my Daihatsu, like I mentioned to you. And the first time I went out to use it, I put it in the center of the rear bumper, and I lifted the whole truck up, the rear of it up. And I wasn't thinking about the unevenness of the ground and how one side of the truck is always heavier than the other. And it fell to the left, and it ripped off my license plate and my license plate light. They are. Well, I've had the handle come back and almost whack me a good time or two, Yeah. Yeah, they really can be. I mean, to all the audience out there, I don't discourage using high lifts personally. I just suggest be very, very careful while using them. Yeah, make sure you're really aware of how high it is, how unstable it really is, and use, if you can, logs or rocks or jack stands, anything if you can, to give that extra support to the chassis or the truck while you're working on it, if at all possible. Out on the trail, it's not always possible, but that's the idea if we can. So. Now, have you ever had like a crazy situation out on the trail that you've had to repair in a pinch, and you've tried to figure out what you're going to do with it? Or well, off-roading, it doesn't have to be just on the trail, but
I had my buggy, a little fiberglass Volkswagen buggy, and I was blasting around out in the dunes, and suddenly a big wham, I hit a sand transition wrong, and it blew the bottom ball joint out, and standing there scratching my head. Luckily, I had manpower, buddies with me, and I was like, well, we could probably put this back in. And then we ran back to camp, and I got a ratchet strap, and wrapped it around the A-arm, and then hooked the hooks together and ratcheted it down. And I was able to drive it right back into camp really well.
That's a good use of a tool that really isn't made for that. I mean, a ratchet strap isn't really made to hold your suspension together, but,
It's a nice thick one. That's the only reason that I had some faith in it. If it was a thin, cheaper one, yeah, I would have just very, very cautiously driven back to camp and called it quits.
That is one thing I want to mention briefly, is that there are cheap tools that you can buy that'll work under certain circumstances, but if you're going to be relying on it to hold I've seen people use cords and stuff to actually have to hold up their transmission because their mount went out, or the cross member broke. It's like, you want a good chain, a good rope, a good strap to do that. You don't want one of these like super cheap, don't have a brand on them, holding up your suspension or your ball joint on your A-arm in your case, if you don't really know it's a good quality strap, because it might have been cheap, but it could cost you a lot more money in the end.
I've actually seen in a couple cases where somebody had like a 4-link suspension, the setup, and the track arm where it mounts to the frame or the axle break. Mm-hmm. And so then the axle is just going crazy, and they took a ratchet strap and they went from the frame to the axle and then did a cross diagonal frame to the axle on the other side, and that held it centered.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good fix for temporary. I mean, you don't want to be driving it like that for a long time, but
Oh yeah, at least to get you, out of a trail or to a flat area where you can do something else.
I saw something really interesting the other day on Facebook. Somebody posted a link or a photo, and he broke his I want to say it was his lower trailing arm on a Jeep, a Wrangler. I think it was one of the new 4-doors, and he used his high lift jack and bolted it to the chassis mount point and then to the axle mount point.
Oh, that's awesome.
He had one of the little 42-inch high lifts or 40-inch high lifts, and he just mounted it and bolted it. Clearly it was sloppy because it's not exactly the width like a bushing would be. But, I mean, it got him down off the mountain, and that's what you're really kind of looking for. So, that's pretty cool. Well, Brad, we've been talking for a little while now, and I really appreciate all the information. It really is a joy to talk to you. You're very, very intelligent with this stuff just from a lot of years of experience with it, and I can tell that you read a lot about what you're doing, and we've talked about that on the forum too before. So, your wealth of knowledge, I really hope to be able to have you on the show again here in the future. So I appreciate you taking your time out of your schedule to be with us here on the podcast, and I'll try to keep you in mind for the future shows if you're willing to do it. And this information that you talked about with us is really beneficial, not only for Isuzu owners, but I understand that there's a bunch of brands out there. People can buy all kinds of different vehicles. So there's a bunch of information here, and hopefully, like I mentioned before, Brad can be back on here with us. So Brad, thanks a lot for being here with us.
No problem. It was my pleasure.
You can hit us up at our email over at ericmcgrew.tv. That's ericmcgrew.tv, and the email is eric@ericmcgrew.tv. We hope to hear from you. Like to hear what kind of projects and stuff you've got going on, your stories as well, and never forget, I may just hit you up and ask you for an interview. So until next time, be safe and have fun out there in your rigs.